The auction hall glowed with chandeliers that dripped gold light over velvet seats and polished mahogany panels. Every whisper in the room seemed rehearsed, every laugh rehearsed, every movement choreographed for an audience of wealth and power. The air carried the weight of money, the silent arrogance of those who believed they were untouchable. At the front stood the auctioneer, a tall man in a tailored suit with a smile sharpened into a sneer, his voice already booming like a hammer of authority. Near the back, a man entered quietly. His steps were steady, measured, his eyes calm as he observed the spectacle unfolding. He was dressed simply, dark slacks, crisp white shirt, worn leather shoes, polished enough to look decent, but not extravagant. His presence drew subtle glances, then hushed murmurs, and finally, cold stares. He was a black man stepping into a space where his very skin was treated as intrusion. The whispers sharpened into daggers. The auctioneer noticed him and paused mid-sentence, his lips curled. The room followed his gaze until all eyes locked onto the man in the back. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer drawled, drawing out each word as though it were a private joke, "it seems we have entertainment this evening." Laughter rippled, polite but poisonous, the kind of laughter that confirmed the hierarchy in the room. The man did not laugh. He held his place, neither retreating nor advancing, his gaze steady on the stage. He clutched a leather folder close to his chest, as though guarding something more valuable than the diamonds glittering in display cases along the walls. The auctioneer's smile widened, venom disguised as charm. He raised one hand, pointing a long finger at the man as if summoning the weight of the crowd against him. "Sir, this is not a marketplace for wanderers or dreamers. This is a hall for pedigree, wealth, and class. People like you belong outside, perhaps watching through the glass. But in here," his voice cracked like a whip, "in here you are out of place." Gasps, chuckles, the shifting of pearls and gold cufflinks echoed around the hall. The man's jaw tightened, but his eyes remained locked, unblinking, on the auctioneer. His silence only fueled the mockery. "Tell me, do you carry enough to bid on the very floor you're standing on?" the auctioneer jeered, and the hall erupted into cruel laughter. Two ushers in dark uniforms began to move toward the man, their steps heavy, their expressions smirking with assumed superiority. The man said nothing. He adjusted the folder in his hands, his grip steady, his breath even. The auctioneer's voice rose again, sharper now. "Filthy intruders like you don't just walk into this sanctum of value. You don't breathe the same air as my bidders. You don't touch what they touch. Animals like you belong in cages, not in halls of refinement." The words cut the air like knives. Some in the audience stiffened, but no one spoke. The silence of complicity pressed heavier than the insult itself. The ushers reached the man. One grabbed his arm roughly. The other snatched at the folder. Papers slipped free, fluttering to the ground like fallen leaves. The crowd leaned forward, hungry to see humiliation made into spectacle. The man bent to gather them, but one usher shoved him backward, sending him stumbling into the aisle. Gasps again, louder this time, mixed with laughter. The auctioneer clapped his hands once, theatrically, as though punctuating the performance. "Escort him out," he commanded, his tone dripping with satisfaction. The man steadied himself. His cheek burned where the usher's hand had struck him, his papers scattered, his dignity assaulted. Yet his eyes, still fixed on the auctioneer, did not waver. There was something there, something unspoken, something none of them understood. A hush began to creep through the hall. It wasn't pity. It wasn't remorse. It was the strange electricity that surges in the moment before revelation. And then the impossible began. The man straightened, his back rigid, his hands slowly collecting the last of his scattered papers. His voice, calm and measured, cut through the room with startling clarity. "You have no idea what you've just done." The ushers froze, confused. The auctioneer blinked, momentarily unsettled by the tone, by the authority laced into the simple sentence. The crowd shifted uneasily in their velvet seats. The laughter faltered. In that instant, the chandelier light seemed colder, sharper, as though the hall itself sensed the shift. Something unseen had entered the room, not carried in the folder, not revealed by the man's clothing, but alive in his bearing, his words, his presence. What they had dismissed as powerless would soon hold the power to shatter them all. And the auctioneer, whose insult still hung like poison in the air, would discover that actions have consequences, and that the man he had tried to erase was someone he should never have crossed. The silence grew heavy. The audience leaned in, caught between cruelty and curiosity, unaware that their evening of jewels and luxury was about to collapse into scandal, judgment, and a revelation they would never forget. Because sometimes humiliation is only the first act. And sometimes the impossible happens right before your eyes. Hours before the chandeliered hall filled with whispers and jeweled laughter, the man had walked through the city with the quiet confidence of someone who had carried both hardship and knowledge in equal measure. His name was David Cole, though no one in that hall cared to know it. He came not in the armor of wealth, but in the simplicity of discipline. The shoes on his feet had walked him through years of late nights and longer battles, through institutions where doors had been closed, and through streets where suspicion clung like smoke. Yet here he was, stepping into the world of velvet and crystal, not as a beggar nor as a stranger, but as someone with purpose. David's morning had begun like any other, though his mind carried a weight few could imagine. He rose early in his modest apartment on the west side, the walls lined with books worn from use. Law, economics, art, history, each spine told a story of countless hours bent over pages, learning, absorbing, preparing. The city outside stirred with sirens and shouts, but within those walls his world was measured, ordered. He ironed his shirt with careful precision, not for vanity, but because appearances mattered when walking into rooms that judged on sight. His folder lay ready on the small oak table, filled with documents sealed, contracts inked, truths undeniable. The streets he walked were not paved with privilege. The corner grocer nodded to him, the elderly woman on the stoop called a quiet greeting. They knew him as steady, kind, someone who carried himself with a dignity that seemed out of place in neighborhoods where hope was scarce. Yet none of them knew the full scope of his work, the weight of what lay in that folder. Only he knew what those papers represented. The culmination of years of study, sacrifice, and battles, fought not with fists, but with knowledge and resilience. When he approached the towering facade of the auction hall, he paused for a moment, studying the stone lions carved into the entrance. Their frozen expressions mirrored the arrogance of those who would soon fill the room. He drew in a breath, adjusted his grip on the folder, and stepped inside. The marble floor gleamed like ice, reflecting golden chandeliers and polished shoes. From the very first step he felt it, the chill of eyes turning, scanning, categorizing. In that space, his presence was an offense before he spoke a single word. The hall itself was a cathedral to wealth. Velvet ropes guarded glass cases that held jewels worth fortunes, each piece a glittering sermon on privilege. Rows of seats stretched in perfect symmetry toward the stage, where the auctioneer would preside like a priest over relics of excess. The air smelled faintly of perfume and aged wine, heavy with the unspoken rule that only the invited, the wealthy, the sanctioned, had the right to breathe it. David moved through the room with steady steps, ignoring the way conversations dimmed when he passed, ignoring the smirks that curled behind manicured hands. He had been in halls like this before, though never as a guest of honor. Years earlier, he had walked into a university lecture dressed in second-hand clothes, his tuition scraped together by sheer determination. Professors had doubted him, classmates had dismissed him, yet he had left that place with honors and degrees that spoke louder than any prejudice. He remembered every slight, every raised eyebrow, every whisper questioning his presence. Those memories sharpened him, tempered him like steel. They carried him now as the auction hall turned its collective scorn in his direction. The folder in his hand was more than paper. Inside lay evidence of transactions, ownership, authority, documents that could shift the balance of power in that room. No one knew, because no one had bothered to ask. They saw only what they wanted to see, a black man daring to stand where they believed he had no right. They saw an outsider, not the architect of something far greater than their jeweled trinkets and gilded ledgers. David's mind moved with clarity. He remembered the words of his grandfather, a man who had worked with calloused hands and broken back, who had whispered to him as a child, "They will try to strip you with their eyes, but never let them strip you of who you are." That memory was alive in him now. He walked with the weight of generations who had been barred from rooms like this, laughed at, beaten, excluded. He walked for them as much as for himself. The auctioneer, still oblivious to the storm he was about to summon, shuffled his papers at the front of the hall, his voice booming with the arrogance of one who believed he was untouchable. David listened in silence, his expression unreadable, his grip firm. Every detail of the room imprinted itself into his mind. The sneer on the faces, the glint of gold cufflinks, the shallow applause for wealth flaunted. It was not intimidation he felt, but a rising calm. As the auctioneer's insults grew louder, the audience leaned in, eager for spectacle. David's stillness only fueled their cruelty. He let the folder slip slightly in his grasp, enough to draw curious eyes without revealing its contents. He did not shout, did not defend himself in their language of rage. He simply stood, his silence more powerful than their mockery. They thought they saw a man cornered. What they saw was a man waiting for the right second to shift the room, to flip the script, to reveal that the outsider they scorned was in fact the center of gravity, holding their entire illusion together. Every humiliation he had endured, every barrier he had broken, every late night of work and study converged on this moment. The auction hall was only the latest stage for a story older than the marble it was built on, a story of arrogance blind to truth, and truth waiting patiently to strike. And as the auctioneer's hand pointed, as the laughter swelled, as the ushers grabbed at him, David's calm deepened. He knew exactly what he carried. He knew exactly who he was. They did not. Not yet. The velvet hush of the auction hall broke under the weight of the auctioneer's booming voice. His lips curled into a smirk that spread like oil across the room. The chandeliers trembled faintly, as if the building itself recoiled from what was about to unfold. But no one in the audience moved to stop it. They leaned forward instead, hungry for spectacle, their laughter bubbling like poison under crystal goblets and diamond rings. The ushers, dressed in black suits too tight around their waists, advanced toward David with the deliberate swagger of men who believed their authority would never be questioned. One of them shoved his shoulder as if to test his balance, while the other reached again for the folder clutched against his chest. The man's knuckles whitened around the leather, the only shield between him and their grasp. "Gentlemen, remove this intruder," the auctioneer commanded, his tone dripping with disdain. He leaned across his podium, theatrically adjusting his cufflinks as if the sight of this man offended the fabric of his suit. "Tonight is reserved for refinement. We cannot allow disruptions." His pause was deliberate, heavy with contempt, as he let the word hang in the air. The crowd filled the silence with nervous titters, eager to align themselves with his cruelty. The first usher jerked the folder free with a violent tug. Papers scattered like startled birds, fluttering across the polished marble floor. Contracts, certificates, pages embossed with seals. They slid beneath velvet chairs, brushed against high-heeled shoes, crumpled under careless feet. The audience gasped, not in sympathy but in delight. They leaned down, peering at the documents without comprehension, their curiosity laced with mockery. "Look at him scramble," someone whispered, loud enough for laughter to ripple through the rows. "A rat chasing scraps." David bent to gather his pages, his movements slow, deliberate. Before his hands could reach them, the second usher shoved him again, harder this time, sending him sprawling onto his back. A woman in the front row covered her mouth with a manicured hand, hiding a smirk behind jeweled fingers. The audience erupted into cruel laughter, clapping as though it were part of the evening's entertainment. The auctioneer raised his hand, calling for silence. His voice sliced through the laughter, sharper now, crueler. "Do you see, ladies and gentlemen? This is what happens when lines are crossed. When those who do not belong attempt to enter our world. Animals wander in, sniffing at treasures they could never afford, and they forget their place." He descended from his podium, each step echoing across the hall like a judge descending to deliver sentence. His polished shoes clicked against the marble until he stood over David, who remained on the ground, his papers strewn around him. The auctioneer crouched slightly, his voice low but amplified by the hush of the hall. "Filthy animals like you," he whispered, the venom slipping through his teeth, "belong in cages, not in halls of refinement." The words struck the room with the weight of a verdict. Gasps filled the air, some sharp with shock, others stifled with suppressed laughter. A handful of faces shifted uncomfortably, but none dared to speak. The silence of complicity pressed heavier than the insult itself, a silence that spoke louder than cruelty. David's jaw tightened. His cheek throbbed where the usher's hand had struck him earlier, a thin line of blood tracing his lip. He inhaled slowly, letting the humiliation wash over him without breaking his gaze. His eyes met the auctioneer's, calm, steady, burning with a fire that only he understood. The auctioneer straightened, brushing invisible dust from his jacket, reclaiming his hauteur. He turned back to the audience with a smile polished for cameras. "Now, if we can kindly resume our evening without further interruptions," he announced. "Our next item, a rare sapphire necklace, will begin bidding at—" But the audience wasn't finished. They wanted more. Their appetite for degradation had been whetted, and now they demanded its climax. "Throw him out," a voice called from the back. Others chimed in, their laughter swelling again. "Yes, toss him into the street where he belongs." The auctioneer basked in the chorus, raising his hands like a conductor. He motioned to the ushers. "You heard them. Remove this man. He has no place here. Let the streets reclaim him." The ushers seized David by the arms, wrenching him to his feet. His folder dangled, empty now, its contents trampled beneath the heels of the audience. His shoulders strained against their grip, but he did not resist. His silence unsettled them, though they masked it with jeers. They dragged him toward the side exit, their movements exaggerated for the enjoyment of the crowd. But then, something shifted. As they pulled him past the first row, David's gaze swept across the faces around him. For a fleeting second, silence fell again, as eyes met eyes. He looked at each of them not with pleading, not with fear, but with a quiet authority that gnawed at their laughter. Some shifted in their seats, suddenly uncomfortable under his stare, though they could not explain why. The auctioneer, sensing his grip on the room wavering, barked again. "Don't look at him, he is nothing, he is no one." His voice cracked slightly, a fracture in the polished facade. He banged his gavel on the podium, the sound sharp but hollow. "Back to order!" But order was gone. The cruelty had reached its peak, the humiliation complete, and yet something in the air felt unfinished. The chandeliers no longer glowed with warmth, but flickered coldly, their light casting long shadows that made the hall seem smaller, suffocating. The audience shifted uneasily, though their lips still curved in cruel amusement. David's voice broke the silence, low at first, then clear, carrying through the hall like a note struck on a grand piano. "You have no idea what you've done," he said, his tone steady, almost conversational. The ushers froze. The auctioneer turned sharply, his sneer faltering. The audience leaned in, drawn not by mockery now, but by a sudden, inexplicable need to hear more. David straightened, shaking free of their grip with surprising ease. He bent slowly, deliberately, to pick up one of the scattered documents at his feet. His fingers brushed the embossed seal glinting in the light, a seal none of them had bothered to notice. He lifted it high enough for the nearest rows to glimpse before tucking it safely back into his folder. The murmurs began, low and confused. What was that seal? What had they just overlooked? The auctioneer slammed his gavel again, desperation seeping into the gesture. "Remove him now!" he shouted. His voice, once commanding, cracked like glass under pressure. "This is my hall. My rules." But the room had shifted. The humiliation carefully orchestrated now trembled on the edge of reversal. The audience, though still cloaked in arrogance, sensed it. They felt the ripple of power, unseen but undeniable, radiating from the man they had tried to break. David stood tall, his eyes locked on the auctioneer, unblinking, unwavering. His lips curved into the faintest trace of a smile, not of amusement, not of mockery, but of inevitability. The impossible was already stirring in the air, waiting for its moment to descend. The ushers held David at the edge of the hall, waiting for the signal that would decide his fate. The auctioneer, sensing the eyes of the audience drifting away from him and toward the man they had mocked, straightened his back and cleared his throat. His voice, trained to command silence across rooms thick with wealth, rang out again, but this time with an edge sharpened by fear. "Ladies and gentlemen, he began, lifting his chin as though nothing had disturbed the sanctity of his stage. "What you have witnessed tonight is nothing more than the predictable theater of deception. A man without name, without status, attempts to worm his way into this hall, carrying falsified documents and counterfeit bravado. Do not be fooled by his performance." He gestured toward David with an elegant sweep of his hand, as if presenting a specimen for examination. The audience followed his lead, their gazes shifting back to the man in the dark suit, some faces skeptical, others still eager to be reassured. A few whispered questions, their doubt gnawing at the edges of the story. But the auctioneer pressed forward, his words weaving a net of control. "I have encountered such impostors before," he continued, pacing the stage like a monarch addressing a restless court. "They come dressed in borrowed dignity, armed with rehearsed indignation, hoping to shame us into silence. They prey upon your compassion, your civility, twisting your kindness into a weapon. But I will not allow this hall, this sanctuary of refinement, to be tarnished by such trickery." His hand slammed down on the podium with a theatrical bang. The sound reverberated, drawing startled gasps that quickly turned into nods. Some in the audience clapped softly, relieved to be told what to think, eager to return to the certainty of superiority. The laughter returned in ripples, hesitant at first, then louder as they drank in his confidence. David remained silent, his posture still, his expression unreadable. He did not resist, did not protest. His quiet unsettled them more than any outburst could have, but the auctioneer knew silence was dangerous. Silence invited doubt. And so he filled the space with his voice, pouring story after story into the ears of his audience like honey laced with poison. "This man carried documents, yes," the auctioneer admitted, tilting his head in mock curiosity. "But have you looked at them closely? Of course not. That is because such papers are easily forged. In my years of experience, I have seen countless frauds attempt to pass counterfeit certificates, bogus seals, elaborate lies designed to manipulate trust. It is always the same playbook, always the same pitiful trick." He paused, leaning forward on the podium. "And tonight, you witnessed him play his part. The indignant glare, the wounded pride, the desperate clutch of papers, as if they held some divine truth. But beneath it all there is nothing. No legitimacy, no substance, only the audacity of someone who believes chaos can buy them respect." A wave of agreement rolled through the room. The narrative soothed their unease. It gave them permission to dismiss what they had seen, to erase the flicker of doubt that had crossed their minds when David had spoken. They wanted to believe the auctioneer, because to believe David might mean questioning themselves, their world, the hierarchy that made them feel untouchable. "Do not misunderstand me," the auctioneer went on, raising his palms as if offering fairness. "I hold no malice toward the less fortunate. Charity, after all, is one of the pillars of civilization. But charity must be guided, controlled, directed toward those who are grateful, not toward those who barge into sacred halls demanding recognition they have not earned." His tone hardened, his words dripping disdain. "This man represents the danger of entitlement. He represents disorder disguised as righteousness." The ushers tightened their grip on David's arms, sensing the shift in the crowd. A few in the audience shouted in support, "Yes, remove him! No place here!" The energy swelled again, the cruelty refueled by the narrative wrapping them like a warm cloak. But even as they jeered, something beneath the surface remained unsettled. A woman in a crimson dress glanced toward the papers still scattered on the marble, one page half tucked beneath her shoe. She bent slightly, curiosity flickering, but the auctioneer caught the movement and struck quickly. "I see even now some are tempted by his deception," he sneered, his voice sharpening. "Let me warn you, ladies and gentlemen, lies are contagious. A single glance at a counterfeit document can plant seeds of doubt that fester into chaos. That is how such men operate. They count on your hesitation, your willingness to question what is obvious." He raised his gavel, slamming it down with finality. "Do not question. See what is before you. A fraud, an impostor, a trespasser unworthy of this hall. Trust your eyes, your instincts, and above all, trust me." The audience exhaled in unison, their tension dissolving under his command. Their nods returned, firmer this time, their complicity re-established. A round of applause erupted, hesitant but building, until it rolled across the hall like thunder. The auctioneer basked in it, raising his hands in mock humility. "You honor me with your trust," he said smoothly, "but it is not I who demand it, it is truth itself." David lifted his head slightly, his eyes scanning the room. The audience avoided his gaze now, their courage buried under the weight of the auctioneer's story. Yet his silence spoke louder than their applause. His stillness, his unbroken composure, gnawed at them in ways they could not name. The auctioneer noticed, and his fury flared. He stepped down from the podium again, his polished shoes clicking like hammers. He stopped just inches from David, lowering his voice so that only the first few rows could hear, though the hush of the room carried it farther. "You think your silence is strength," he hissed. "You think standing there staring at me with those eyes makes you more than you are. It doesn't. It only makes you pitiful. It only proves that you have nothing left to say, because your lies are unraveling before us all." He straightened, his voice rising again. "You see, ladies and gentlemen, this is the final act of the pretender. When exposed, they retreat into silence, hoping it will grant them dignity. But silence is not dignity, silence is surrender." The audience cheered. They clapped, whistled, some even laughed in relief, as though the tension had finally been resolved. The narrative was complete, neatly tied, easy to digest. They had witnessed humiliation. They had doubted for a flicker of a second, and now they were reassured. The system was intact. Their place in it was secure. The auctioneer returned to his podium, lifting the sapphire necklace high under the chandeliers. "Now let us proceed," he declared. "The starting bid is 500,000. But as the paddles lifted and numbers were called, an undercurrent of unease still rippled through the room. They laughed, they bid, they played their roles, yet the image of David's steady gaze lingered at the edges of their minds. His silence had not broken him. It had only sharpened the moment into something they could not escape, and though the auctioneer believed he had won, though his fabricated story wrapped the hall in a fragile sense of control, the impossible was already stirring. It waited in the scattered papers, in the unspoken doubts, in the truth that no amount of performance could erase. The night was not over. The bidding resumed with its familiar rhythm, the sound of paddles lifting, numbers shouted, and the auctioneer's gavel punctuating each sale like the beat of a relentless drum. On the surface, the hall had returned to order, the scandals smoothed away by the practiced voice of the man on the podium. Yet beneath the glitter and applause, a silence coiled, invisible and suffocating. Every chandelier sparkled with a brilliance that felt almost mocking, the crystals scattering light across marble floors and velvet gowns, as though nothing unusual had happened. But in the corners of the hall, in the nervous glances exchanged between strangers, something trembled. The illusion of harmony felt fragile, stretched thin by the memory of the confrontation that refused to fade. David stood at the edge of the room, flanked by ushers who shifted uneasily despite their rigid postures. They had expected him to resist, to fight, to create the chaos that would justify the violence against him. Instead, his silence had become a weight heavier than any words. He did not struggle, did not lower his gaze. He simply existed with a dignity that unsettled everyone who dared to notice. In the front rows, a man adjusted his cufflinks, his laughter forced and brittle. "A fine recovery by the auctioneer," he whispered to his companion, but his voice cracked slightly, betraying the unease he could not smother. The woman beside him nodded too quickly, her pearls trembling against her collarbone. "Yes, of course. Quite right." But neither of them could shake the image of the papers scattered across the floor, the bold lettering that might not have been counterfeit at all. At the back of the hall, the woman in the crimson dress who had bent toward the papers earlier still could not look away from them. One corner of a page peeked out from beneath the heel of her shoe, a seal embossed in gold catching the light. She shifted her weight unconsciously, as though protecting it, her mind circling questions she dared not speak aloud. The auctioneer, sensing those questions lingering in the air, drove the bidding harder. His voice climbed higher, his gestures grander, filling the hall with a performance so dazzling it left little room to think. He pointed, commanded, laughed, and scolded, his presence like a storm sweeping through the rows. The audience clung to his energy, desperate to be carried back into the safety of spectacle. Yet for all his mastery, the cracks were there. Each pause in his rhythm seemed longer than it should have been, each glance toward David quicker and sharper than before. He had convinced them once, but conviction was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the smallest truth. He knew it, and the knowledge gnawed at him like a rat in the walls. The ushers shifted again. One cleared his throat, another adjusted his grip on David's arm, though David had not moved an inch. Their eyes flicked toward the crowd, then away, unwilling to meet the gazes of the few who still watched with unease. They were supposed to be invisible, extensions of the hall itself, but tonight their presence felt like chains, visible and ugly. The silence spread not as absence of sound, but as a current of tension. Conversations were too quick, laughter too sharp, applause too eager. It was the silence of people pretending nothing had happened while every heartbeat whispered otherwise. David's eyes moved slowly across the room. He saw the man with trembling cufflinks, the woman clutching her pearls, the young clerk who scribbled notes with hands that shook. He saw the crimson dress, the way her foot still pressed against the page as though anchoring herself to something she didn't yet understand. He saw it all and said nothing. The auctioneer caught his gaze once more and faltered. It was only for a breath, a stutter in his otherwise flawless delivery, but it was enough. The paddles lowered a fraction, the laughter paused and the hall inhaled. He recovered quickly, slamming his gavel, roaring out numbers with renewed vigor, but the seed of doubt had been planted again. Outside the tall windows, the night pressed close, heavy and watchful. The moonlight painted pale streaks across the glass, and for a moment it seemed as though the world itself leaned in to witness. Inside, the chandeliers swayed slightly, their crystals chiming faintly with the draught, like whispers too soft to hear but impossible to ignore. Minutes stretched into eternities. Each new sale was louder, each cheer more forced, each attempt at normalcy digging deeper into the absurd. They were performing civility not because they believed it, but because they feared the alternative, acknowledging what they had truly seen. The woman in crimson finally shifted her foot, letting the edge of the page slip free. Her eyes darted to the podium, to the ushers, to David. She wanted to reach down, to seize the document and hold it high, but her hand trembled against her lap. She imagined the sound it would make, the gasps, the fury of the auctioneer. She imagined being silenced the way David had been, and so she stayed still, her restraint adding another layer to the silence that pressed against them all. The auctioneer's voice cracked again, this time disguised as a laugh. He slammed the gavel harder, too hard, the sound echoing through the hall like a gunshot. Some flinched, some laughed nervously, some applauded just to fill the space. But the cracks widened. The hall no longer moved as one body. Small fragments of doubt scattered like glass, invisible but sharp. And David waited. His patience, his stillness, became unbearable. It was no longer the silence of defeat. It was the silence of inevitability. The audience felt it, though they could not name it. Something was coming. Something had already begun. The crimson dress shifted again. The young clerk stopped writing. The man with trembling cufflinks tugged at his collar as though choking. Even the ushers, meant to hold power, began to look over their shoulders as if afraid someone unseen was watching. And in a way, someone was. The silence itself was watching, growing, coiling, waiting for its moment to strike. The auctioneer shouted another number, his voice raw now, his face flushed. His control was slipping, though most in the room still pretended not to see it. But David saw. David knew. His eyes never wavered, and his silence roared louder than the auctioneer's every word. The impossible hovered just beyond the edge of the moment, seconds away, waiting for its reveal. The auctioneer's voice cracked again as he tried to force enthusiasm into the room. Another antique painting was rolled to the front, its gilded frame catching the light, but the brilliance of its gold only seemed to mock the unease that had spread like smoke across the hall. He lifted his gavel, pointed toward the crowd and shouted numbers as though volume could repair what was already unraveling. Yet every cheer, every paddle lifted, carried hesitation. They were pretending, and everyone knew it. David had not moved. His silence was heavier now, pressing into every corner of the hall. The ushers at his sides shifted uncomfortably, their grip loosening though they had not yet realized it. They were used to dragging out troublemakers, to silencing those who disrupted the theater of wealth. But this man had not played his role. He had refused to be loud, refused to be unruly. He had stood with a composure that made their violence look obscene. And the more time passed, the more obscene it became. The woman in crimson finally bent down. Her hand trembled as she touched the edge of the page that had slipped free from under her shoe. Her fingertips brushed the embossed seal, the raised letters unmistakable beneath her skin. She inhaled sharply, realizing what she held, and her eyes widened with the weight of recognition. She looked around as though the very walls might punish her for knowing the truth. The auctioneer saw the movement and his chest tightened. He slammed his gavel harder than necessary and laughed too loudly, covering the sound of his fear. "A fine bid from the gentleman in the corner. Can I hear 2 million? His words rang hollow. He could feel the silence stalking him now, feel it circling like a predator. He had won the first round when he humiliated David, but something had shifted. The man had not broken. He had not begged. And the audience, despite themselves, had noticed. The woman in crimson stood slowly, the page pinched delicately between her fingers. Gasps fluttered across the rows as eyes turned toward her. She did not speak, not yet. She only held it up, the seal glinting under the chandeliers, undeniable in its authority. The hush that fell was deeper than before, thick and electric. The auctioneer froze, his words stuck in his throat. For the first time that night, he had no script. His performance, so carefully controlled, faltered in the face of a truth he could not silence. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then forced out a laugh that cracked under its own weight. "A clever forgery," he sneered, his voice brittle. "You'll find such tricks at every street corner." But no one laughed with him this time. Too many had seen the papers scatter. Too many had noticed the man's stillness. Too many had doubted in silence. The woman's voice broke through, clear and sharp. "This is no forgery." She held the page higher, her tone carrying authority she hadn't known she possessed until now. "It bears the seal of the Department of Justice." The hall erupted. Voices collided, chairs scraped, pearls clattered against marble as bodies turned toward the revelation. Some gasped, some whispered, some protested, but no one remained unmoved. The ushers at David's side stepped back instinctively, as though the paper itself had burned them. David finally spoke, his voice calm yet powerful enough to cut through the chaos. "I tried to show it to him," he said, each word deliberate, "but he chose humiliation over truth." The silence that followed was deafening, heavier than before. His eyes swept the hall, meeting the gaze of the trembling cufflinks, the young clerk, the woman in crimson who still held the page aloft. Each pair of eyes that met his felt the sting of complicity. The auctioneer's face drained of color, then flushed crimson with rage. "Enough of this," he barked, slamming his gavel so hard the handle cracked. "Guards, remove them both." His command hung in the air, but the ushers did not move. Their eyes darted between David and the page, between the seal and the crowd. For the first time they hesitated. David stepped forward, his wrists still marked by the grip of the ushers, but his posture regal. "Do you want to know who I am?" His question carried no arrogance, only inevitability. "Do you want to know why you will regret every second of this night?" The crowd leaned in unconsciously, caught between fear and fascination. The auctioneer sputtered, his voice shrill. "You are nothing but a fraud, a common—" David cut him off with a quiet power that silenced the hall. "I am the man who holds the authority to shut this place down. I am the one whose signature decides whether these auctions continue or end in disgrace. I am the one who investigates corruption in institutions like this." He paused, his words landing like stones thrown into a still pond, each ripple spreading wider. "And tonight you revealed yourselves." The crimson dress gasped, the paper shaking in her hand. The clerk's pen fell to the floor. Even the chandeliers seemed to flicker as though the electricity itself recoiled. The auctioneer staggered back, his gavel dropping from his fingers with a dull thud. David reached into his jacket pocket slowly, deliberately, every eye fixed on him. He pulled out a black leather case, its gold emblem unmistakable. He opened it with a calm finality, revealing the badge within gleaming under the lights. "Federal investigator," he announced, his voice resonant. "Civil Rights Division." Chaos erupted again, but this time it was different. It was not the chaos of disbelief, but of reckoning. Conversations clashed. People rose to their feet, some trying to leave, others craning forward to see more. The woman in crimson stumbled into the aisle, holding the page out as though it were sacred. "He tried to show us," she cried, her voice breaking. "He tried, and we let this happen." The ushers stepped fully back now, their hands dropping to their sides. They no longer saw a trespasser, but a man who could decide their futures with a single report. Their faces paled with the weight of realization. The auctioneer tried to recover, tried to summon his old authority. "This is absurd," he shouted, his words desperate. "Anyone can carry a badge, anyone can—" David's gaze locked on him, and the man faltered mid-sentence. "Then explain why your staff tore apart federal documents on the marble floor," David said, his voice sharp enough to slice through the noise. "Explain why you called me a trespasser instead of reading the seal in front of your eyes. Explain why you thought humiliation would erase the truth." The silence that followed was worse than any shouting. The auctioneer's mouth opened and closed, his throat working but no sound coming. The hall, once his stage, had turned against him. David stepped forward, the badge gleaming, his presence filling the room. "I was here tonight not as a guest," he said, "but as an investigator, and you gave me more evidence in 5 minutes than I could have gathered in 5 months. His words rolled over the audience like thunder. Every slur, every laugh, every act of silence has been recorded. Every camera in this hall captured the truth you tried to bury. The chandeliers swayed with the vibration of voices rising again, but this time the voices carried anger at the auctioneer, at the system that had allowed such cruelty. Some stood and shouted for justice, others demanded accountability. The hall was no longer his sanctuary. David turned to the crimson dress, his voice gentler now. "May I?" She handed him the page with trembling hands, relief flooding her eyes. He held it high for all to see, the seal shining undeniable. "This," he said, "is not a forgery. It is a subpoena authorizing the inspection of this auction house for discriminatory practices, and tonight you proved every suspicion correct." The clerk in the back whispered, awed and shaken, "It's real. My God, it's real." The auctioneer sagged against the podium, his hands gripping the edge as though it could hold him upright. His empire of confidence crumbled, exposed in front of those who had once worshipped him. David's voice rose again, steady and unyielding. "This place was built on exclusion, on arrogance, on the belief that some voices do not matter. Tonight, you silenced me in front of hundreds. And tonight, in front of those same hundreds, I will make sure the world hears what really happened here." Gasps turned into shouts, shouts into chants. The audience, fractured moments before, had united in shock, in anger, in the raw electricity of revelation. Some turned their phones upward, capturing every second, streaming it beyond the walls of the hall. The impossible had happened. The man they had dismissed, mocked, and silenced had revealed himself as the one with true power, and no one could undo it. The auctioneer collapsed into his chair, his face ashen, his hands shaking. He whispered something to himself, too faint to hear, as if trying to rewrite the night in his own memory. But it was too late. David stood at the center, the badge in one hand, the subpoena in the other. And for the first time that evening, the hall was utterly his. Phones rose like a forest of glass and metal, the glow of screens casting eerie halos across the marble columns. Every angle of David's revelation was being captured, duplicated, streamed into an endless sea of watchers beyond the hall. The world outside no longer had to imagine what injustice looked like. It was unfolding live, each detail too sharp, too undeniable to be spun away by clever words or broken gavels. The auctioneer stumbled backward, sweat beading his forehead. He could hear the hiss of whispers around him, each one slicing through the protective bubble he had carried for years. These were the patrons who once admired his charm, who trusted his voice to guide their fortunes. Now their eyes reflected only suspicion, disgust, and the dawning realization that they had laughed at cruelty just minutes before. David remained still, the badge glinting, the subpoena raised. He did not need to shout. The silence of certainty did the work for him. Slowly he turned his gaze across the room, letting it rest on each face in turn, forcing them to meet the truth head-on. Every person who had sat in smug silence when the slurs were spoken, every one of them who had pretended not to hear the insults, now felt his eyes as judgment. The crimson dress sat heavily in her chair, her hands trembling as though she carried a weight she could never set down again. She had laughed earlier, not loudly but enough to be part of the chorus. Now she saw herself reflected in the horror of the truth, realizing how quickly she had surrendered her conscience to the easy comfort of conformity. Her phone buzzed in her purse, but she did not move. She knew the messages had already started. People asking if she had been there, if she had seen it, if she was part of it. In the back row, the young clerk held his phone upright, live streaming despite the tightness in his throat. His viewers exploded in the comments, words flashing faster than he could read. Exposed. This is history. They thought he was powerless. He swallowed hard, knowing that tomorrow his name would be tied forever to this night, whether he wanted it or not. The auctioneer tried again, his voice trembling with desperation. You don't understand. This is a performance, a stunt. He is no one. His words cracked under the weight of disbelief surrounding him. For the first time, no one rushed to defend him. His power, once absolute in this hall, had dissolved like mist under sunlight. David lowered the subpoena to the podium, placing it deliberately where the gavel had fallen. The sound of paper against wood echoed louder than any hammer. "The world will see," he said quietly, but the words carried like thunder. "The world will decide." And outside the hall, the world had already begun. News alerts buzzed onto screens across the city. Clips uploaded within minutes spread like wildfire. The moment the slur had been spoken, the moment the badge was revealed, the gasps, the silence. Each video was dissected, reposted, translated, transformed into evidence of something far greater than one humiliation. Inside the hall, panic began to ripple through the audience. Some tried to slip out quietly, heads lowered, hoping their faces had not been caught in the damning footage. Others whispered excuses to one another, already rehearsing the narratives they would tell tomorrow. "I didn't hear clearly. I thought it was a joke. I didn't know who he was." But their excuses were weak, even in their own ears. David stood firm, watching them scatter like shadows under light. He did not gloat, did not smile. His eyes carried no triumph, only a deep sorrow that it had taken so much cruelty for the truth to surface. The ushers, now pale and trembling, approached cautiously. "Sir," one whispered, "what would you have us do?" The reversal in power was complete. Moments ago they had dragged him like a trespasser. Now they awaited his orders as though he were the master of the hall. David looked at them, his face unreadable. "You will do nothing," he replied. "Every action has already been recorded. Your silence tonight will speak louder than your obedience ever could." The ushers lowered their eyes, shamed not only by what they had done but by the mercy they had been granted. The auctioneer collapsed into his chair, his body sagging like a marionette with its strings cut. He mumbled incoherently, fragments of excuses spilling from his lips. Protocol, mistaken identity, just business. But no one listened. His words had lost their currency. The crimson dress rose suddenly, her voice trembling but loud enough to carry. "I was wrong," she said, her eyes wet with tears. "We were all wrong." The room turned toward her, startled by the confession. She clutched her pearls with shaking hands. "We watched and did nothing. We laughed when we should have spoken. I will not remain silent now." Her declaration cracked the dam. Murmurs rose into shouts, some agreeing, others condemning, the hall fracturing into chaos. Phones captured every confession, every argument, every denial. The court of public opinion was in session, and there would be no recess. David remained still, his composure unbroken, even as the hall descended into noise. He knew the truth no longer depended on him. It had taken root in the room, in the recordings, in the eyes of everyone who had witnessed it. The impossible had already happened. The powerless man had become the arbiter of truth, and the system built to silence him had collapsed in its own arrogance. He stepped away from the podium, leaving the badge and subpoena behind, their presence enough to continue the trial without him. The chandeliers flickered once more, not from failing light, but from the weight of history pressing against the walls. Outside, reporters crowded the entrance, their cameras hungry for a glimpse. Inside, the auctioneer's empire crumbled in real time, and David, walking slowly toward the doors, carried himself not with victory, but with inevitability. Because tonight, justice had slipped its chains, and no gavel could silence it again. The doors had barely closed behind David when the first tremor rippled through the foundations of the auction house. It was not the kind that shifted marble or cracked chandeliers, but the kind that shattered reputations and sent centuries of inherited prestige tumbling into dust. The house had always prided itself on permanence, on being older than wars and richer than kings, a sanctuary where fortunes were sealed with the tap of a gavel. But permanence was an illusion, and illusions die fastest when light pierces them from all sides. The crowd that remained sat stunned in their velvet chairs, the air heavy with whispers that had mutated into arguments and accusations. "He set us up," hissed one man in a tailored tuxedo, his voice trembling. It was a trick. But even he could not convince himself. The evidence had been too sharp, too clean. The slurs had echoed too loudly, preserved in countless recordings already flooding the outside world. His words, like the auctioneer's excuses, dissolved into nothing. At the podium, the auctioneer slumped forward, his hands gripping the edge of the wood as though he could anchor himself to authority. But authority had fled him. His gavel lay abandoned on the table, a symbol not of control but of the moment it had been ripped away. The murmurs of the crowd grew into a restless tide, each patron calculating the damage to their names, their fortunes, their futures. For these were not merely guests, they were investors, heirs, politicians, people whose wealth was tethered to reputation. And tonight, reputation had been dragged through the mud with them watching in silence. Outside, the media storm surged. The first headlines blared across phone screens and tickers. Auction scandal explodes. Racial humiliation exposed on camera. Reporters crowded the gates, shouting questions no one dared answer. Limousines idled on the street, their tinted windows hiding trembling hands dialing lawyers, advisors, crisis consultants. 1,000 spin machines roared to life, but their gears ground uselessly against the raw footage already saturating the internet. Inside, the crimson dress trembled as she rose again. "We cannot stay here," she whispered to no one and everyone. "This place is finished." Her words carried on the fragile current of shame, cut deeper than any formal declaration. One by one, others began to stand, abandoning the auctioneer as though proximity alone carried contagion. The exodus was hesitant at first, but soon it became a flood, heels clattering against marble, voices rising in frantic calls for drivers and security. The auctioneer shouted after them, his voice ragged. "Sit down. You are part of this house, part of this tradition. You cannot turn your backs." But tradition no longer commanded obedience. His words bounced off the gilded walls and returned to him hollow, reminders that power is only power when others agree to bow before it. In the mezzanine, a row of investors huddled together, their faces pale. One whispered, "Our shares will collapse by morning." Another replied, "Not by morning. Tonight." And he was right. Even as they spoke, markets overseas began to ripple. Private groups who had pledged millions to the house's next season of sales withdrew quietly, their statements crafted with cold precision. "We do not condone discrimination. We will not associate with institutions that tolerate injustice." The sentences were polite daggers, cutting the house's arteries one by one. David walked slowly down the stone steps outside, the flash of cameras illuminating him like a prophet descending from fire. Reporters surged forward, microphones thrust into the air. "Who are you really?" one shouted. "Why tonight?" cried another. David did not answer. His silence was more eloquent than their questions, for in silence he denied them ownership of the narrative. The story belonged to the footage, to the truth already unleashed. He moved through the crowd with unhurried dignity, as though he had all the time in the world, while around him the auction house gasped its last breaths. Back inside, the young clerk stood frozen, his live stream still running. Hundreds of thousands now watched through his lens, his viewership multiplying by the second. Comments raced faster than his eyes could track. He flipped the script. Justice live. This is the end of them. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing he was holding a mirror up to history. The auctioneer pounded the table with his fists, desperate to reassert control. This is not over. Do you hear me? This house has stood for centuries. One man cannot destroy it. But the words sounded like madness, the raving of a monarch who has lost his crown. His assistants, once loyal shadows, edged away from him, unwilling to be dragged into his downfall. Their silence was louder than his shouts. Then came the sound no auction house should ever hear, the shattering of trust in the form of cancelled bids. Phones buzzed in the pockets of patrons still seated, their screens flashing notifications from banking apps and brokerage firms. Bids placed earlier that evening were being reversed. Funds clawed back before the hammer could fall. Contracts unraveled in real time, buyers invoking clauses about fraud, discrimination, reputational risk. Paintings worth millions suddenly hung unsold, their gilded frames mocking the empty promises of prestige. The collapse accelerated. Security teams, once tasked with keeping the uninvited out, now struggled to keep enraged protesters from flooding in. Word had spread across the city, carried on live streams and hashtags. Auction house exposed. Within an hour, the front steps swarmed with voices demanding justice, their chants shaking the foundations of the marble hall louder than any gavel strike. Inside, the crimson dress clutched her pearls so tightly that the string snapped, beads scattering across the floor like fallen fortunes. She gasped, realizing too late that the symbol mirrored her own unraveling. The clerk's camera caught it all, his feed now immortalizing not only the humiliation of one man, but the disintegration of an entire institution. The auctioneer slumped into his chair, defeated yet defiant. He muttered under his breath, fragments of the arrogance that once defined him. They will forget, they always forget. Money heals all wounds. But even he could see the truth. The world had changed. Forgetting was no longer possible in an age where every cruelty could be replayed endlessly, dissected, shared, weaponized. His cruelty would live forever in pixels and memory. In the hours that followed, the auction house became a crime scene of reputation. Investigators arrived, summoned not by justice but by the sheer gravity of scandal. Lawyers poured through the doors like scavengers, collecting fragments of contracts and correspondence, each one a piece of evidence in the lawsuits already forming like storm clouds. Staff whispered of resignations, of emails hastily deleted, of files destroyed too late to escape forensic eyes. David, meanwhile, disappeared into the night, his figure swallowed by the city's shadows. But his absence only amplified his presence. Commentators on news channels replayed his silence, his calm, his revelation. They called him a symbol, a mystery, a reckoning. The impossible had not only happened, it had been broadcast, magnified, made immortal. By dawn, the auction house's name trended worldwide, not for masterpieces sold but for humanity betrayed. Stock prices plummeted, sponsors fled, and rival houses circled like predators sensing blood. The once unassailable giant had been reduced to a relic, its walls heavy with the shame of its own complicity. And those who had sat in silence during the humiliation of one man now found themselves on trial in the court of conscience. Their faces, caught in the corners of videos, became emblems of bystander guilt. Their names, once whispered with admiration in corridors of wealth, now carried the bitter taste of cowardice. The collapse of the auction house was not a single event, but a cascade, each stone of arrogance dislodging another until the entire edifice crumbled. And at its center, the quiet strength of a man who had refused to bow, whose dignity had shattered centuries of illusion. Justice had not come from gavels or tradition. It had come from truth too bright to be ignored, carried in the hands of strangers with phones, amplified by voices once silenced. The marble hall, once a cathedral of wealth, now stood as a monument to arrogance undone. The auctioneer, alone at his podium, finally understood what David had left behind. Power does not live in titles or gavels or gilded halls. Power lives in the truth, and once revealed, it cannot be hidden again. By the time dawn spilled across the skyline, the scandal had already outgrown the marble hall that birthed it. What had begun as a humiliation whispered over velvet seats now blazed across continents, igniting conversations in languages and cultures far removed from the gilded confines of the auction house. The impossible had traveled faster than light, carried in the circuitry of millions of devices, until no corner of the world remained untouched. In New York, morning commuters huddled over glowing screens, the footage playing silently on subway cars as eyes widened and mouths tightened. The slur, the slap, the sudden reversal, all of it looped endlessly in the digital veins of the city, impossible to ignore. On the trading floor, brokers barely looked at the tickers as the auction house's stock collapsed. Instead, they replayed the 30-second clip, their expressions caught between disbelief and awe. In Paris, a cafe television broadcast the scene on repeat. Patrons leaned forward, coffee forgotten, as subtitles spelled out the word spat in hatred and the silence that followed. A young woman whispered to her grandmother, "It's always the same." And the older woman nodded slowly, her eyes clouded with memories of times when dignity had been stripped with a laugh and justice never came. But this time, she murmured, perhaps the story would end differently. In Lagos, crowds gathered around outdoor screens. The footage streamed from a shaky smartphone connection onto projectors and battered televisions. The audience erupted, not just in outrage, but in cheers at the moment the badge gleamed and silence swallowed the hall. "That's ours," one man shouted, his fist raised. "That victory belongs to all of us." Around him, voices rose in unison, chanting the name of justice in languages that wrapped around one another like threads of the same tapestry. In Tokyo, businessmen paused in immaculate towers, their meetings derailed as the scandal played across global news channels. They analyzed not only the outrage, but the economic carnage rippling outward. Contracts cancelled, sponsors fleeing, reputations destroyed. "Prestige," one executive muttered, "is the most fragile currency." And everyone in the room nodded, their eyes fixed on the image of the auctioneer crumbling under the weight of truth. The global reaction fractured into 1,000 streams, but all flowed from the same source, the recognition of injustice laid bare. Hashtags sprouted like wildflowers, blooming across languages. Auction scandal, justice unmasked, dignity unchained. Each tag carried millions of voices, building a chorus too vast to silence. Memes appeared within hours, juxtaposing the sneer of the auctioneer with the calm dignity of David, captions skewering arrogance with surgical wit. Injustice had become not only a rallying cry, but a spectacle that no spin doctor could redirect. Governments could not ignore the tidal wave. Statements poured from official channels, each one crafted with careful outrage. The mayor of the city condemned the actions as an affront to human dignity. The Prime Minister called for a review of policies governing elite institutions. Senators and parliamentarians across oceans seized the moment, aligning themselves with justice in hopes of riding the current of public fury. Yet beneath their words lay the unmistakable tremor of fear, the fear of being the next to stand exposed under the world's unblinking gaze. Religious leaders spoke from pulpits, weaving the scandal into sermons on morality and the danger of unchecked pride. In mosques and churches, in temples and synagogues, the story was retold, not as entertainment but as parable, a reminder that no hall of gold could shield cruelty from divine reckoning. On university campuses, students marched with banners that bore David's silhouette, his raised subpoena transformed into an icon of resistance. Speeches crackled from megaphones, echoing through courtyards. They tried to bury him in humiliation, but they forgot he was the seed. Professors rewrote lectures overnight, using the scandal as case study in law, ethics, and the anatomy of systemic arrogance. Meanwhile, within the fragile walls of the auction house, collapse hardened into ruin. By the second day, 3 board members had resigned, their letters leaking to the press with confessions of complicity. By the third, lawsuits numbered in the dozens, filed by patrons, employees, even artists whose works had been tainted by association. Each complaint clawed at the institution's flesh, leaving it weaker, more skeletal. Journalists dug deeper, unearthing stories long buried under polished press releases, Whispers of previous humiliations surfaced: anonymous staff, silenced interns, dismissed security reports. Every forgotten cruelty re-emerged, stitched into a damning quilt that covered the house in shame. The scandal was no longer about one night, one insult. It had become the revelation of an entire culture built on arrogance and impunity. David, however, did not speak. He did not grant interviews, did not post online, did not explain himself. His silence became legend. Commentators speculated endlessly. Was he a prosecutor, a judge, a symbol sent by fate? His refusal to claim the spotlight transformed him into something greater than an individual. He became an idea, unclaimed, untainted, free for the world to carry as its own. In classrooms in São Paulo, children watched the footage projected on walls, their teachers explaining the meaning of dignity, of standing tall when mocked. In Johannesburg, barbershops buzzed with debate, voices overlapping in heated agreement that history had shifted. In Berlin, graffiti artists painted murals overnight, the face of the auctioneer crumbling into dust beside the unshaken gaze of David. But not all voices cheered. In hidden corners of the internet, forums filled with resentment spat back with venom, twisting the narrative into lies. It was staged, they wrote. He provoked it. Their words were brittle, desperate, but they carried danger. Hate does not vanish under light. It only retreats to darker shadows. Yet even there, the footage was too stark to deny. The world had seen, and once seen, it could not be unseen. Cultural institutions scrambled to distance themselves. Museums cancelled contracts with the auction house. Philanthropists quietly redirected their donations. Even rival houses, usually bound by unspoken codes of solidarity, issued statements condemning the scandal. The auctioneer's empire had become toxic overnight, a contagion no one wanted to touch, and in living rooms across the globe, families gathered to watch the story unfold. Parents explained to children why the insult had been wrong, why the silence that followed had been complicit, why the revelation mattered. Tears flowed in some households, rage in others, but everywhere the story embedded itself into the collective memory. This was not just an incident, it was a mirror held up to humanity, reflecting both its cruelty and its capacity for justice. The auctioneer himself became a prisoner of infamy. Hounded by cameras, abandoned by allies, he wandered corridors once gilded with admiration, but now echoing only with disdain. His name, once synonymous with prestige, was now shorthand for disgrace. He hired lawyers, crafted apologies, pleaded for context, but nothing could erase the footage. Every word he spoke was measured against the silence of David, and every word failed. In the global marketplace, the ripple became a wave. Collectors withdrew from elite auctions, fearful of association. Prices of artwork dipped, not for lack of beauty but for fear of scandal. The art world, long insulated by wealth, now found itself exposed to a public it had dismissed. The people, through their screens, had claimed a voice in a realm that once ignored them. Politicians seized the opportunity. Proposals emerged for stricter oversight of elite institutions, for codes of conduct that extended beyond legality into morality. The scandal had become more than a spectacle. It was policy, reform, revolution, dressed in the language of justice. And through it all, David remained silent. His absence became presence. His refusal to speak became the loudest testimony of all. The truth required no embellishment, no performance. It stood alone, undeniable. Weeks later, the auction house shuttered its doors, its crest removed from marble walls, its name struck from directories. The building stood hollow, a mausoleum of arrogance. Tourists came not to admire art but to take pictures of the place where pride collapsed. Guides whispered the story with reverence, as though it were myth. But it was not myth. It had happened, captured in the unflinching eye of 1,000 cameras. Months later, governments cited the scandal in debates about justice. Courts referenced it in rulings. Professors published papers dissecting its anatomy. And in the quiet corners of the world, ordinary people whispered the name of the man who had stood unbroken, a name they never truly knew, but carried like a banner. The aftermath was not only global, it was personal. Children bullied at school repeated the image of David standing tall, drawing courage from it. Workers humiliated in offices replayed the clip to remind themselves that dignity could survive even the cruelest mockery. Activists carried the footage to rallies, holding phones aloft as though they were shields. The scandal had crossed borders, crossed cultures, crossed the fragile line between event and era. It was no longer just a story. It was a landmark in the landscape of justice, carved not by courts, but by the collective gaze of humanity refusing to look away. And so the impossible did not end in that hall. It lived on, carried by voices, amplified by outrage, sanctified by hope. The auctioneer's disgrace became the world's lesson. David's silence became the world's roar. The collapse of an institution became the rise of a movement. And the world, forever changed, learned that sometimes the most powerful gavel is not wood striking marble, but truth striking the conscience of humanity. The echoes of scandal did not vanish with the closing of the auction house's doors. They reverberated across courtrooms, newsrooms, parliaments, and dinner tables, stretching their reach into places where marble and chandeliers had never gleamed. In the weeks that followed, the world demanded more than outrage. It demanded consequences. Legal proceedings began with unusual speed, a sign of how deeply the scandal had wounded public trust. Prosecutors assembled a case against the auctioneer, drawing not only from the footage of that night, but from years of quiet complaints unearthed in the storm's aftermath. Whispers once dismissed as gossip hardened into testimony. Former employees spoke of a culture of cruelty, of instructions to belittle certain guests, to favor others, to preserve prestige at any cost. Documents revealed policies carefully crafted to conceal discrimination under the guise of exclusivity. In the courtroom where the auctioneer now sat as defendant, the atmosphere was electric. The man who once commanded bids worth millions now stared at cracked paint on the ceiling, his hands trembling as they clutched the arms of his chair. Cameras lined the back wall, broadcasting every twitch, every swallow, every attempt to rebuild the arrogance that had deserted him. But arrogance is a fragile mask, and his kept slipping, revealing the hollow man beneath. Witnesses took the stand one after another. A woman described how she had been mocked for her accent while attempting to bid. A man recounted being escorted out for wearing a suit deemed unworthy of the hall. Former staff told stories of instructions whispered through earpieces. Keep them out. Make them feel small. Remind them who belongs here. Each testimony landed like a hammer on the fragile edifice of his defense. The footage of that night was replayed, frame by frame, dissected until no doubt remained. The slur, the sneer, the laughter of the crowd, and then the silence when the badge appeared. It all burned into the courtroom as though it had happened again. Jurors winced, reporters scribbled, and the auctioneer sat motionless, shrinking further with each replay. David did not appear in person. His lawyers submitted evidence, his silence continuing to define him as much as his revelation had. Some whispered he feared retribution. Others believed he wished to keep the focus on the institution rather than himself. Whatever the reason, his absence only amplified the weight of his presence. He was there in every recording, every gasp, every headline. He was the ghost the auctioneer could never escape. When the verdict came, it was not a surprise, but a release. Guilty on multiple counts: discrimination, fraud, violation of civil rights statutes. The gavel struck. But it was not the auctioneers this time. It was the state's, and its echo signaled the end of an empire. The sentence stripped him of fortune, barred him from his profession, and condemned him to years not in gilded halls, but in confinement. For a man who had built his life on exclusivity, prison was not merely punishment, but inversion. The walls that once kept others out now locked him in. The collapse spread further still. Rival institutions scrambled to adopt reforms, desperate to avoid the same fate. Diversity charters were drafted overnight, oversight committees established, training programs announced. Whether genuine or performative, the changes signaled a shift. The old arrogance had been pierced, and even if cynicism remained, fear kept it from resurfacing unchecked. But the legacy of the scandal was not confined to boardrooms or courtrooms. It seeped into the fabric of culture itself. Artists painted murals of the moment the badge gleamed. Poets wrote verses about silence, shattering arrogance. Filmmakers began scripting documentaries, weaving the footage into narratives of justice and resistance. Schools incorporated the story into curricula, teaching children that dignity could not be auctioned, that truth could silence even the loudest cruelty. In communities once ignored, the story took root as proof. Proof that injustice could be exposed, that humiliation could be reversed, that silence could be broken. People carried their own stories to the light, emboldened by David's. Complaints filed in workplaces surged, protests swelled with confidence. Voices once hesitant now thundered with certainty. If he could stand there, so can we. And still, David remained silent. He did not write a book, did not sell his story, did not appear on talk shows. His refusal to profit from the moment became legend. In an age where fame was currency, he rejected the vault. That rejection elevated him, turning him into something no wealth could manufacture, a symbol uncorrupted. Years passed, but the footage did not fade. It replayed at anniversaries, appeared in montages of historical turning points, was cited in speeches by leaders and activists. The auctioneer's name withered into a footnote, but David's silhouette endured, eternal as a shadow etched into marble. The hall itself, once the cathedral of wealth, was transformed. Activists lobbied for its closure, historians for its preservation. In the end, compromise prevailed. The building reopened not as an auction house but as a museum of justice. Exhibits traced the rise and fall of the institution, the night of the scandal, the global wave that followed. Visitors stood in hushed silence before the looping footage, some weeping, some cheering, all recognizing that they were standing where history had broken and remade itself. A bronze plaque was placed at the entrance, inscribed with words simple yet immovable. Here, arrogance was unmasked. Here, dignity prevailed. Here, the world remembered that truth is the highest bid. The plaque bore no names. David's choice. His lawyers had delivered his condition to the committee. No monuments to individuals, no statues, no biographies. Only the moment, preserved as lesson, as warning, as hope. He would not let himself be carved into idol. The story belonged to everyone. And so it was. Across the globe, the scandal became shorthand for a shift in consciousness. Politicians invoked it when arguing for reform. Teachers cited it when teaching courage. Parents whispered it to children as reassurance that power does not always win. Its legacy was not bound to the walls of one hall, but scattered like seeds across the soil of humanity. David lived quietly, far from cameras, far from marble. But sometimes, late at night, people swore they glimpsed him at protests, standing silently among the crowd, his presence like a ghost, reminding them why they marched. No one ever proved it, and perhaps that was the point. He was not meant to be a man in the end. He was meant to be a reminder. The auctioneer in his confinement faded into obscurity. His arrogance, once towering, shrank to mutters in shared cells. Inmates who learned of his past treated him with the scorn he had once inflicted, forcing him to taste humiliation without velvet or chandeliers to soften the blow. He became a cautionary tale, even among the forgotten. The legacy of that night remained not because of punishment, but because of transformation. It reminded the world that silence could break arrogance, that truth could topple marble, that dignity could rise even when mocked. It reminded the world that history is not written by the powerful alone, but by those who refuse to bow. And so, when the footage played on the anniversary of its revelation, millions paused once again. They watched the slur, the silence, the badge, the impossible. They watched and they remembered. They remembered that justice had no price, no gavel, no hall. Justice was the breath of dignity, carried by one man who refused to break and by millions who refused to look away. The impossible had become inevitable, and the world, forever changed, carried its echo into the future where truth would always find a way to be seen.